welcome to another episode of SlatorPod. Hi, Esther.
Hey, Florian.
Well, I hope everyone's safe and healthy out there. It's been another working from home week for half the planet, probably even 2/3 of the planet now, as everything is going into lockdown, shutdowns of various severity and levels here. Well, really, thanks for subscribing to everybody and listening to this. We now have really a fantastic audience of like hundreds of listeners across all of the channels. There's like a gazillion ways to be able to download this podcast. And of course, we're also uploading on YouTube, which adds a little bit of complication in terms of the images. Anyway, let's move to, well, we're going to have to talk a little bit about Corona and the situation right now. And then we're moving on to other stories. We had a fantastic article this week based on an even more fantastic research paper around machine translation and some of the flaws in how this has been evaluated, the quality of machine translation has been evaluated. I found it extremely interesting, and it's like a very high-level group there. We'll speak of that, publish that paper. So, and then we'll talk about also TransPerfect's Lionbridge lawsuit. Never miss a pandemic. Or a pandemic can't stop the lawsuits between the two biggest players there. All right, so probably 95% of the listeners now are working from home, and so we picked up a lot of interesting news this week in our sweep service, the daily email that's going out to subscribers. A lot of associations right now are appealing to governments to support independent translators, interpreters, mostly, of course, conference interpreters. I mean, their business has evaporated overnight, and a lot of them are independent. So there's a lot of good work being done by national associations, regional associations that are really highlighting the plight of these freelancers and professionals. Then also there's a lot of companies doing messaging, how they're doing the contingency planning, how they're still able to support their clients and business, as companies as large as SDL or Keywords with 5,000-6,000 staff have gone full remote. This is an impressive achievement if you consider, right? I mean, these companies have 20, 30, 40 offices, and now all of a sudden you're moving fully to remote. There's also been some other stories. Let me just pluck out some of the LSPs, or a few. Well, let me highlight one that we saw that's actually cutting rates across the board, or at least announced it. There was a tweet by a translator that had an email from the Big Word that said they're doing across the board 15% cuts, which I don't think is a great time to do right now. And we validated this. It's an actual email. So I'm not sure this is a great time for them to do that. Anyway, we continue to compile a lot of responses to the current crisis in our lockdown piece we published last week. It's a kind of a living article, so we're continuing to add to it. So you can go and check there for the latest. Some things that came out this week, we had SDL, Zoo, and Keywords, because they're listed on the stock market and they had actually some results scheduled. They provided fairly comprehensive updates on their situation at the moment. We had SDL that went virtual, I mean, the whole company basically, right, including the CEO that tweeted out how he's now working from home. They stressed they had a very strong business contingency program going on, but they also highlighted that they're cutting some costs and moving some production in-house. I think, Esther, you wrote that article, right? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it was a total of 4,500 employees that they said they'd moved to working from home, which, as you said, is sort of a huge undertaking. And they've also adapted some sort of sales and marketing activities to the current climate as well. So lots of sort of initiatives and planning going on around how to continue to support their clients in the wake of Corona.
Okay. We also had Zoo, the media localizer. We spoke about them before. One interesting point that they raised when they published their, well, it's not the results because the market regulator said you're not allowed to publish any financial results for a while. But they but they updated the markets anyway with some other things. So they're saying that they're seeing slowing originals production. So the Netflix and whatever streaming providers of this world are slowing the production, or maybe even stopping, because California is on lockdown. So the production of originals is slowing, but they're now seeing an increased demand for back catalog localization. So titles that were already in store that they're doing localization for now. And then finally, keywords to game localizer / game services providers. They're seeing some additional demand in some areas from their clients, because their clients, of course, are also praising their production and now maybe trying to have their vendors do some additional work for them that wasn't originally planned to go out to a vendor. And so they're saying that they actually, so far in some of those areas, demand is outstripping capacity internally for the short term. So that's very interesting. And then something I saw yesterday, David from MemSource, the CEO of MemSource, the translation productivity tool, he posted something on LinkedIn, very interesting. He said that they actually haven't seen a slowdown at all. They've seen an uptick. So from 3 billion words in February translated across their user base, they're now at 3.5 billion words translated. For what it's worth, I don't know, but at least they're not seeing any collapse or anything in terms of the amount of words that are processed on MemSource. So I think we should follow up on that in the coming days and weeks and see if others have similar data points that they're willing to share. So there's obviously business evaporating for one part of the industry, and then especially, I guess, if you're in technology, the big tech companies are seeing a massive spike in traffic and volume. Facebook, Google, all of these big companies, they're probably in more need than ever to get their message out. And so if you're in these types of areas, you're probably not seeing any slowdown for now. But it's certainly, many freelancers are hurting. So I really hope they're getting the support they deserve. And Esther, you just pinged me a couple hours ago about something that the UK is doing there.
Yeah. So the Chancellor yesterday unveiled a package for freelancers, self-employed people in the UK, which is bringing the aid broadly in line with the package that they previously announced for employees and employers. So self-employed workers in the UK can now apply for a grant worth 80% of their average monthly profits. So there is a cap on that, up to a maximum of about £2,500, which won't be paid apparently until June, but will be backdated until, since March, and will be paid as a lump sum. So that's part of what they're trying to do to provide some financial aid and support to people who are working as freelancers, self-employed in the UK, which would include
translators and interpreters, right? 80% of the profit. Did you look into this a bit more? What does profit mean if you're a freelancer? What's a profit?
Well, I think it's not the revenue, obviously. So whatever you're invoicing per month, you would then be deducting some expenses from that, I think. So this is a taxable sum anyway. So I think obviously had they done it on revenues, it would not have been taxable. But I think, to be honest, let's not go there. It's probably best we don't. I think this is where my understanding and knowledge of being self-employed in the UK stops. But it has been a very, very complicated road. And I think this probably covers about 95% of people working as self-employed in the UK. Okay. Obviously, they had to cap it, and some people aren't going to be eligible. But I think this was quite detailed and quite thought out as to how they could support in a similar way to employees, which is obviously a bit more straightforward. Yeah, and then in the US you have this giant stimulus package, $2-3 trillion. These amounts we've never seen before. We don't know how much of that is going to end up in the hands of people in this industry that really need it. Again, conference interpreters to me come to mind first. Here in Switzerland, the National Association for Translators and Interpreters appealed to the government as well to not forget, independent professionals. In this, they've announced some plans here as well to support all kinds of businesses, big and small. So it's a little early to tell, but we're definitely going to cover this going forward as well. So look.
that's it for this week's Corona update, and we'll certainly going to continue to provide a lot of coverage on this. There's a lot of virtual events going on. We're going to do maybe a survey here and there, and then we're going to aggregate a lot of the information that's being put out there and make sure that people get the updates they need on Slator.com. So let's move on to something non-corona, but that is exceptionally interesting. We came across a paper by a group of leading researchers in machine translation. So you had a good read there, and so let us know what's this about.
Yeah, this is a paper that was published earlier in March. It's entitled A Set of Recommendations for Assessing Human-Machine Parity in Language Translation. So this, as you mentioned, was led and authored by a group of quite prominent researchers really in the language industry. So Samuel Lorbley from University of Zurich, Rico Senrick also from Zurich University, Graham Neubig from Carnegie Mellon, Quinlan Chen, also from Carnegie Mellon, Sheila Castillo from Dublin City, and Antonio Terral from University of Groningen. So this was a study really of those claims about human parity, which obviously most of us will have been aware of, basically saying that the original claims are that now machine translation, neural machine translation has reached a point where the output is on a par with human translator level. So looking into some of this and really came to the conclusion that it's to do more with the way that machine translation is being evaluated. So there are some limitations in the methods used, which ultimately mean that yes, by these parameters, machine translation output is the same quality as human translation output. However, the methods for evaluating machine translation output is actually flawed. So they kind of looked into some of these flaws, some of these issues and shortcomings with the methods that are currently being used to evaluate machine translation quality. And they were looking at previous studies, so studies that had already been done where some of these neural machine translation systems had performed at or above the level of human translators in previous studies. So they came up with really three main areas where they said that quality of machine translation could be improved in terms of how we're evaluating it. So they were looking at the choice of raters, they said, is actually really important. So it stands to reason who the person that's rating or evaluating the output is going to have a big impact on yes, no, is it as good as a human? So what they actually found was that human professional translators tended to prefer human translations, whereas crowdsourced and non-expert raters didn't. So non-expert raters tended to prefer machine translation output, whereas if you ask a translator, they would prefer the human translations, not knowing necessarily that it was a human translation.
Probably not knowing.
Exactly, just instinctively. And translators also provide more nuanced ratings, is what they said. So probably less binary, I would imagine, but I'm not too sure exactly what that refers to. So one thing was the choice of raters. They said obviously that affects a lot of how the evaluation generally.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Please, yeah.
I mean, this would seem so obvious. I mean, this is almost like if you have a QA person, quality assurance, or a person in a professional translation workflow who has no idea what they're reading, and then but then give an opinion on it. Like, how are you going to review a professional translation if you don't understand what it's about? You don't understand the terminology. You're just going to guess. You're just going to read and say, well, this kind of reads like it's fluent, but I have no idea what I'm reading.
Yeah, I suppose. I think for me, there's two things here. One is obviously the cost. I think this is not necessarily news, but asking professional translators to rate and assess machine translation output is expensive. So that was one thing that they highlighted, saying, but okay, even though we might be recommending this, we understand that it's an expensive undertaking.
But then what's the point of even doing an analysis if you're using people who have no idea what they're doing? I mean, this just seems to me like, okay, it's a human. It's not a parrot. It's not a dolphin. It's a human, and that person can read, and the person is probably a native speaker of the language. But like, if they don't know what they're reading, how can they evaluate? So yeah,
but then I don't know, from my side, I think I understand where you're coming from. However, if you think about target audiences, right? Who are you preparing these translations for? Are these translations only for professional translators, or actually is most of what's going to be translated in the world is not going to be read by professional translators? It's going to be read by the general public.
Okay, well, interesting. We have a little bit of a back and forth here. So, general public, but then again, a big chunk of the translation industry services very specialized use cases and very specialized readers. So lawyers are going to pick up on very small differences there, and life science professionals, doctors, technical document people that assemble major big machines. So, well, long story short, I think they used a shortcut to use some of those those crowds to evaluate. But I mean, at the end of the day, then making claims that it's as good as a human translation just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Okay, well, let's go to the second point. So we got the choice of raters, and then what's next? Yeah.
Well, and also, I am kind of playing devil's advocate here. Sure. I do actually think that it's better to use human translators. The availability of linguistic context. So this also is a concept that I think we've discussed on Slator before about document level evaluation of machine translation versus sentence level evaluation. So generally speaking, the study found human translations are significantly more accurate in the context of a document, but not necessarily at sentence level. So, I mean, this also stands to reason when you think about evaluating sentences in isolation, whereas actually something that's quite important to document quality would be cohesion, coherence, and sort of agreeing pronouns and what have you. Yeah. And the third and final thing here was the creation of reference translations. This is where it gets slightly complex, I think, but what they found here was that human translations were significantly better than machine translations when the source texts were original source texts. However, where some source texts that we had been used for machine translation were themselves translations. So if the input had been, and this is where I sort of lose the thread slightly, I have to say. But I mean, basically, it's to do with the quality, I think, of this input that's going in. Yeah. So maybe just to sum up with a few of their recommendations, and they did obviously welcome as well further research in this area, and particularly around how to overcome the issue of cost associated with human evaluation or using professional translators. But the recommendations were to appoint professional translators as raters, to evaluate documents and not sentences, to evaluate fluency on top of just adequacy. And another recommendation was do not heavily edit reference translations for fluency, because I think that also has a detrimental effect. And make sure you're using original source texts, so not translations as source text. So those were their 5 recommendation points there.
I like it. I also like how practical this is all. This all is.
Oh yeah,
it's very practical. Yeah. I mean, we're going through. Probably by now I've gone through 500 of those research papers. Probably since we started covering this, we probably looked at 5,000. I don't know, but a lot of this is even math and figure, and it's very complex. This is very practical. This is very down to it's very useful and very kind of concrete recommendations. Maybe that's also influenced by Samuel. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say I like it because, I mean, as time goes on, we'll just see more and more and more claims of human parity. But actually, is it really meaningful if the metrics that you're using to assess it just don't really, aren't adequate?
It's not. And so I think maybe some of this is, I mean, I don't know the genesis of this particular paper, but I know that Samuel, one of the he's a PhD at the university, but he also is a partner in Text Shuttle, which is an MT kind of managed services firm. So he sees kind of real life daily problems, and looks like this might have influenced this very kind of concrete set of recommendations there as well, maybe. Yeah. I should have probably asked him before I speculate, but
there we go.
All right. So, let's close the podcast on a light note. I'm just kidding. But TransPerfect versus Lionbridge, number one against number two in terms of revenues in this industry. As I said, don't let a good pandemic stop you from litigating. So, although this has started a while back, let's just recap what this is all about. TransPerfect and Lionbridge, right? So a long time ago in 2015-16, a judge ordered TransPerfect to be sold to the highest bidder. I'm not going to go into all the details there. The two founders were at odds, and they couldn't proceed. So the judge ordered the company sold. Eventually, two final bidders emerged. One was the CEO, Phil Shaw, part owner, and the other one was Lionbridge's owner, HIG, a private equity firm. And as it goes in these M&A transactions, you have a data room where all of the sensitive information is hosted. And so, long story short, and I'm really trying to give my best to summarize this because it's the US, it's legal, it's difficult, but TransPerfect alleges that Lionbridge got some information from that data room they shouldn't have gotten, or that they misused in ways they shouldn't have, like client lists, price lists that they then used after the bid was over, that after the process of selling the company was over, they misused that to get a competitive advantage. Because of course we all know that eventually Phil Shaw actually was able to win that bid and buy, well, the half of the company he already owned before. So they're now moving. I mean, they've submitted this lawsuit in, I think, April. Then Lionbridge filed the so-called motion to dismiss in June. And now the judge took more than half a year, 9 months, but now ruled that 8 of 10 claims by TransPerfect can go to discovery. So what this means is, and again, I'm not a legal expert in the US, but discovery means that you're going through emails, records, maybe text messages, whatever, to get to the bottom of this, and those depositions that people will have to go on the record and explain. On the one hand, it's interesting that two of the biggest companies in this industry are fighting each other. I mean, that's definitely something that, we're going to follow, but also that due to that discovery process, a lot of information that's usually kept under wraps is going to come out, because these lawsuits are going to be public, and probably some of the discovery is going to be public as well. So there's going to be a lot of internal info that we're going to be reading soon. Mm-hmm. So we can't comment on the merits of this lawsuit. Lionbridge says it's meritless and it's fantasy, and TransPerfect obviously says the opposite. So let's see how this plays out. Then we had a couple more stories this week that we could briefly touch on. There was one more that we can maybe just briefly touch on. So, the European Union offers 4 million in grants to what they call language tool developers. So between 200 and 800,000 euro to get to connect to that automated translation tool that the European Union has set up. Sounds very complicated in a way, but why would you need a public sector MT tool? We should probably look into this a bit more, but at the end of the day, it's probably good news for some of the technology companies out there, because I would say that funding from the private sector is probably dried up, at least for the next couple of months. So if you can get a European Union grant, good for you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was it for today. Again, stay safe, and look forward to hosting another podcast next week. Thanks, Esther.
Yep. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.